Welcome to the webinar. This webinar was recorded on February 9th, 2021. It was presented by Denise Mahon, Outreach and Policy Manager of the BC Community Gaming Branch, and hosted by BCACG, BC Association for Charitable Gaming.
Just as we get started, I wanted to first acknowledge the traditional land. I'm speaking to you today from Victoria, which is the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen people, which known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nation. Generally, when we're all together in the same room, we are all acknowledging the same land that we're gathered on, but since we're in virtual environment and have been for some time, I just wanted to take a moment to invite you all to acknowledge the traditional territory that you're currently viewing this presentation from today. So just to give a bit of an overview of what we're going to cover today, as I mentioned, we're going to start with talking about what's new for the grant year 2021-22, and then we're going to talk kind of the program essentials, as well as organization eligibility, talking about the program eligibility, a section on spending the grant. So if you get grant funding, how can you spend it? And then we're going to talk about how do you, kind of the nuts and bolts of applying for the grant and timelines and things like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about our $5 million capital project grant stream, as some of you may not be as familiar with that one. And at the end, we'll have some resources, as I promised, and then we'll open that up to a Q&A session after that. Okay, so what is new for 2021-22? So, you know, it really goes without saying the biggest factor over the last year has really been COVID-19. The not-for-profit sector in BC has really quickly pivoted to continue providing those essential services to British Columbians, including, you know, many vulnerable people who are really affected by the outbreak and continue to be. We've heard from organizations who've had to modify their programming, cancel, postpone, you name it, due to COVID-19. And certainly the challenging financial situation that many folks find themselves in. So in response to what we heard in early spring last year, we adapted our program policies and procedures, and we will be continuing many of these for the grant year that we're now in. So we've relaxed and adapted several program criteria in order to continue to provide that flexibility and ensure that organizations can continue to be eligible for funding. So what some of these flexibility measures are, we opened the human and social services sector early last year, and we're going to open it early again this year. So it will open up on June 1st, and that's just to recognize the increased demand that this sector has had and to be able to respond in a timely manner. We have relaxed the operating surplus criteria for return applicants, recognizing that cash flow management has been really a challenge due to postponed programming and a lot of organizations getting temporary government aid. And we have also relaxed the 75% government funding limit for programs, also noting that community and volunteer involvement has been impacted. And we have also relaxed the requirement for programs to have been delivered for 12 months at the time of application for returning applicants again, and for new programs that are addressing COVID-19 related needs. And we've introduced one temporary COVID-19 response measure, and that's that community gaming grant funding can be used to create new paid positions in 2021 to help organizations retain the people that they need and increase their capacity, which previously we didn't allow grant funds to be used for new positions. So that's something that's brand new. And as you may know, we update our guidelines every year in response to input and feedback that we received throughout the previous year from stakeholders, from applicants, from our staff. So these updates, so we have more kind of minor updates. So these are just policy changes that are usually pretty small in scope and clarification and improvements to our existing policy. And that's all kind of done with the intention of just continually improving our program. So just to give you an example of what some of those are, we added a notification to applicants that publicly available materials and information on an applicant's organization or programming may be viewed as part of application assessment, and that's really just to get a little bit more information if it's not clear through the application itself. We have updated the organization eligibility criteria to provide greater clarity on organization membership and additional information on board of directors election and governance requirements. And we've added a couple of new subsectors for the sport and arts culture sector to better capture programming that's in those sectors. So some of these things that I mentioned, we'll kind of talk a little bit more as we go through the program criteria and the eligibility criteria, and you'll kind of see where these come into play. So yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit more detail. So the Community Gaming Grants Program Guidelines are our main policy document for our program. They set out intake dates, policies, procedures, etc. for the coming year. And these were just released just at the start of last week. So those are up now if you haven't already seen them. So the guidelines have these new changes reflected for the year, as well as all the information on our program. So you've probably seen them before, but we always encourage you to read through these again, especially in advance of preparing and submitting your application. Okay, so now let's get into the program essentials, just a kind of general overview of our program. So our program provides $140 million annually, and this is kind of broken out into different sort of buckets, if you like. So there's $135 million for our main community gaming grant program, and that's to help not-for-profits deliver ongoing programs. We also have a $5 million separate capital project grant program, and this is to help not-for-profits with specifically capital projects or acquisitions. And all of this is funding with provincial commercial gambling revenues. So our program is not a competitive grant process. So if an organization is eligible and their programming is eligible, they will receive some funding based on what they ask for and what they're assessed at. For the 2020-2021 grant year, the one that just recently closed, we're not nearly through assessing all of the applications, but so far 95% of those who applied have received a grant. That's a little bit higher than what it usually is. It's usually around 90%. So I think some of the temporary measures may have helped with that this year, but we'll see how it all shakes out once all the applications have been assessed. And then as well, really to date, the average grant amount is around $25,000 per organization, and obviously this varies greatly, as you may know, but I think that kind of reflects all the community level programming that is taking place across the province. Typically in a year, we will fund approximately 5,000 organizations, so pretty much every community in the province sees some funding from our program, which is pretty awesome. So as you can imagine, not-for-profits deliver many different kinds of programming across the province. So what we've done is our program is separated into 6 unique funding sectors, and that just helps us to organize our intakes and notifications, helps us track funding to different sectors, helps us to specify the kinds of programming and services that our program supports under each sector. So I'm going to run through each to kind of give you a sense of what each sector is about. So our program opens with the arts and culture sector, and under this sector, it's really about programs that provide public access to and or preservation of the arts, heritage, or culture. So examples of programming that we see is really around performing arts, education or performances, art galleries, fairs and festivals, museums, etc. Under the sports sector, this is really about community-based or amateur programs for organized competitive physical activity. So what we see under here is kind of all your typical youth and adult sports leagues, so soccer, baseball, hockey, basketball, etc. And we also provide some funding for Special Olympics as well as senior games. And we also have an environment sector, And that's really about programs that revitalize, protect, or provide education on ecosystems and the environment. So some types of programming that we see here is around ecosystem conservation, outdoor education, climate change adaptation. And we also provide funding for animal shelters and animal rehabilitation and wildlife centers under this stream as well. So for the other three, we've got our public safety sector, and that's for programs that enhance and support public safety initiatives. That includes things like volunteer firefighting, search and rescue, outdoor recreation, like hiking, biking trails, things like that, as well as disaster relief and emergency preparedness. And then we've got our human and social services sector, which is our biggest sector because it includes just so many things. But how we kind of group these ones together is that it's for programs that significantly contribute to the quality of life in a community or group. So some examples of programming under this stream include things like childcare, services for people with a disability, mental health and counseling, community building programs, seniors activities, as well as service clubs, which I'll talk a little bit more later on. And then finally, we have funding for parent advisory councils and district parent advisory councils. So this is to support the enhancement of extracurricular opportunities for students in the K-12 system. And the way that this one is determined, it's through previous year's enrollment in a school at $20 per student. So that is all of our sectors. So we have different program funding levels depending on really the size and scope and area that's served. So at the local organization level, we can provide funding up to $100,000, whereas a provincial level organization, that is kind of the go-to for the entire province, we can provide up to $250,000. And then in the middle there, regional organizations can have up to $225,000. So funding levels aren't guaranteed, and the level of funding awarded is really based on the size and scope of the programming that's presented in the application and through the demonstrated financial need that is shown in the program actuals and budgets. Okay, so that's kind of the broad strokes of our program. So now what we're going to get into is a little more detailed sections about the organization eligibility, the program eligibility, and things like that. So let's get into the organization eligibility now. So as I mentioned a moment ago, our program is really for not-for-profit organizations. So to be eligible for a grant, an organization must be a not-for-profit. They must deliver programs and services to the community. They must have an open membership, and what we mean by that is that anyone who wants to join the group, be a member, they can do that. There's no restrictions. They must have a volunteer board and voting membership. So for this, we are required to see that more than double the number of voting members to board members. So as an example, if you had 5 board members, we would want to see at least double, which would be 11 plus. As people who are voting members in that organization. The board members must be democratically chosen through election. 2/3 of the board members must reside in BC, and board members don't receive remuneration for their role as a board member. So on the flip side, an ineligible organization would be an organization that's for profit, obviously, a member-funded society, and really what this means is it's a special distinction under the Societies Act. And if your organization had indicated you are a member-funded society, which is essentially a society that exists primarily for the benefit of their members, then that would make an organization ineligible. If an organization is a political party, political action group, or lobby group, they would not be eligible. As well, any form of government is not eligible for our program. So that's from the federal level all the way down to the local level. Hospital, medical, or healthcare facility, education institution or school, or provincially or municipally operated facility like a library or museum, all of those as well would not be eligible for our program. So we have financial eligibility criteria for organizations, which you may be familiar with, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. But basically, in order to be considered for a grant, applicants must meet that specific organization financial eligibility criteria, and this is assessed through the following documents. So we require that organizations submit to us in each application a revenue and expense statement for the previous fiscal year. So in other words, the most recently completed fiscal year for that organization, a balance sheet for the previous fiscal year for that organization, an organization budget for the current fiscal year, and if there are any accompanying notes with your financial statements, that those would be included as well, just to help us kind of see what's going on with your financial statements. So an organization would be temporarily ineligible for a grant if it earned more than $250,000 in its previous fiscal year through its own licensed gaming events. So these will be things like 50/50 or raffles for fundraising. If the organization exhibits conditions that cast doubt on its financial stability, or if the group had more than 50% of its previous fiscal year's operating expenses on hand in unrestricted funds at the start of its current fiscal year. And you'll see here that I've got some asterisks with that caveat that for this grant year, this is one of those criteria that we are being flexible on for return applicants. So if an applicant is having a difficult time meeting this criteria because their finances are kind of in disarray, they would not have their funding levels negatively impacted if they're not able to meet the criteria. So a little bit more about this surplus calculation. So the branch determines financial need of an organization by assessing the cash on hand that's proportionate to their expenses. So how and why do we calculate the surplus criteria? Well, basically we subtract any gaming funds, liabilities, or restricted funds of an organization's current assets, and we assess this against the organization's operating expenses to come up with this surplus percentage. Just to note, organizations don't need to do this calculation themselves. This is really just for information purposes and transparency so that you know how we're doing it and what we're looking at. And the analyst who assesses your application does this based on the financial documentation that you provide to us. So just to kind of give a pretty basic example, say an organization's operating expenses are $200,000, and the organization has $150,000 in current assets, as well as $50,000 in a combination of gaming funds, liabilities, and restricted funds. So that $50,000 in gaming funds would be subtracted from the $150,000 in current assets, leaving a sum total of $100,000 in current assets that we would be assessing. So then we would divide that current assets by the operating expenses, so $100,000 divided by $200,000, which would indicate that the organization had a 50% surplus. As I mentioned, for the current grant year, this criteria will be flexible for those who have been affected by COVID-19. All right, so now we've covered off the organization eligibility criteria as well as the organization's financial eligibility criteria. And now we'll talk a bit about the program eligibility criteria. So community gaming grants really supports a very wide range of programs, as you may have guessed from all the different sectors that we support. Applications for funding must be submitted on a program basis. So what that means is that we provide funding for programs, not for organizations' operational costs. And the way that we define a program is that it is an ongoing service, activity, or series of activities. The program must benefit the community, respond to a community's needs, and be accessible and open to all community members. And the program must be delivered for at least 12 months before it's eligible. So again, you see that caveat there for this year. So for 2021-22, return applicants whose programming was affected by COVID-19 will not have their funding levels negatively impacted if they're not able to meet this criteria. Because obviously we understand that there's been a lot of disruptions to programming, so we're not going to penalize folks if they weren't able to run it for the past 12 months. In addition, we will waive that 12-month previous delivery requirement for new programs that are responding to COVID-19 related community needs and priorities. So what makes a program eligible? So as I mentioned, there's the criteria that the program must have been delivered for 12 months, but as I just mentioned, that we're being a bit more flexible on that this year for return applicants. Eligible programs must be directly delivered by the applicant organization. It must be ongoing and continuous, so not a project or something that's short-term in nature. It must provide an immediate and direct service to the community, and it must be accessible and inclusive. So it's got open access, there aren't restrictions on who can benefit from the programming or service. So how does an organization apply for a program? So there's two examples here. This example is where an organization delivers one program. So essentially all program activities fall under, all the activities that an organization does falls under one program. So we've got the Sunshine Minor Hockey Association, and they run the Sunshine Hockey program. So the program includes all services delivered by the organization. That would be hockey for various age groups, coach training, ref training. Essentially everything they do is under that umbrella of the hockey program. And then the other example is where an organization offers multiple different programs. So an organization can apply for funding for each discrete program within the same community gaming grant application. So the example here, we've got the Sunshine Arts Council. They run a program that is to do with their public art display and gallery. They've got a summer folk music festival, and they've got youth art lessons and camps. So this organization has 3 different programs. Each of them have different program activities. They can apply on the same application for all 3 programs, and each of those programs would require their own set of separate program descriptions and program financials, which we'll talk a bit about in a second here. So ineligible programs, what would make a program ineligible? Programs that exclusively serve an organization's membership and aren't open to the public would be ineligible. Programs that provide financial assistance or things that function like direct assistance to individuals. Fundraising programs or social enterprise programs. Programs that are solely about operating a facility or a venue. Long-term housing programs are not eligible. Programs that deliver vocational training are not eligible. Programs that are delivered on contract or under a funding agreement with another organization are not eligible. Programs that primarily benefit other organizations are not eligible. And really kind of wrapping it all up, any program that doesn't deliver an immediate direct service to the community would not be an eligible program. So describing the program. So I'd mentioned a moment ago about a program description for each of the programs that an organization is applying for. So what this is, as part of the application, we require a program description for each program to really tell us what is it the program that they're delivering and kind of all the key information that just kind of gives us a pretty good view of what's taking place. So it should really be about 1 to 3 pages per program, trying to make it as clear and concise as possible, and include all of that key information. So the who, what, when, where, how, all those things that are going to paint a picture of, what programs or what program are you delivering, why are you delivering it, who's benefiting from it, how often do you hold it, why is it needed in your community, who's involved, how do you advertise it, all those things like that really are going to, as I say, paint the picture of what it is that you're doing on a day in, day out basis for that program. Like our organization financial eligibility criteria, applicants also must supply program financials in order to determine the program's financial eligibility. So we require a program revenue and expense statement, otherwise known as actuals, for the previous fiscal year of the organization, and a program budget for the current fiscal year for each program that the organization is applying for funding. One of the program financial criteria is that government funding cannot exceed 75% of the total program cost. And one of the main reasons for this is to see demonstrated community support for the program. And that is in showing that applicants have at least 25% of their program operating costs coming from non-government sources. And this can be through things like user fees, fundraising, in-kind contributions, and so on. And if government funding exceeds the 75% threshold, funding may be limited or denied. But again, here's the caveat for this year, where this is one of those criteria that we are relaxing for return applicants who've had difficulty being able to demonstrate this criteria. They wouldn't have their funding levels negatively impacted. And the last thing I'll say before I move on is that all sources of a program revenue must be clearly stated in the program financials that are provided. So I've mentioned a few different financial documents so far on both the organization side of things and the program side of things. So I thought we could just pause for a moment and summarize. So organization financials, what we require there for the whole organization is a balance sheet for the most recently completed fiscal year, the organization's revenue and expense statement, or actuals, for the most recently completed fiscal year, as well as the organization's budget for the current fiscal year. And then on the program financial side, for each program that an organization is applying for funding for, we require the program revenue and expense statement, or the actuals, for the most recently completed fiscal year. We require the program budget for the current fiscal year, and the program in-kind volunteer contribution summary if an organization is including those as part of their program revenues, and that would be for the most recently fiscal year. And I'll talk a bit about that, that summary sheet in a second here. So our website has examples of all the financial documents that I've just mentioned. This example on the screen here shows some program financials. So what we're looking at here is an example that shows the revenue and expense statement, and that's the column on the left, as well as the current year budget showing on the right. And so you can see in this example, all revenues are clearly identified. They are including some in-kind volunteer labor, and that is showing on the example sheet that we've got here. So in-kind volunteer contributions that I just mentioned. Organizations can include in-kind support or contributions as part of their program financials. This is a really great way to not only show community support and investment, but these contributions can be a really good way to show greater program revenue and expenses to support your requests for funding. And it can also help if organizations are finding that government funding is making up a large portion of their program revenue that might put them over that 75% government funding limit. And in-kind support can be used to contribute toward the remaining 25% of a program's operating costs. And this can help groups that don't have many other funding sources. So in-kind support can really include any combination of volunteer time, donated labor, equipment, services, and materials from other sources, from third-party sources over the last 12 months. And the valuation of volunteerism and donations kind of follows the following standards for our program. So for donated materials, these are valued at verified fair market value. For donated accredited professional services, so something like an accountant, that would also be valued at verified fair market value. And volunteer labor is valued at up to $20 per hour. And just to note there that This hourly rate is really only for the purpose of calculating the in-kind volunteer contributions in grant applications specific to this program. If you do include any in-kind contributions in your program financials, this must be listed as both a revenue and expense so that it'll balance out to zero. And the information on your program's in-kind support must be submitted using our in-kind contribution summary, which we have an example of on this slide. And this can also be found on our website. So this summary sheet basically just helps us to determine eligible costs, so basically costs that are related to the program delivery. And as with all of the other documentation, complete records of all volunteered hours and donated services or materials must be retained as part of your organization's gaming records. So before we move on to talking about spending grant funding, I just wanted to mention two other kinds of programming that the community gaming grants funds that are just slightly different than other types of organization programming. So I mentioned early on that service clubs can apply for funding through our program. So those are for groups like Elks, Legions, Lions, etc. So they can apply for a community donations program, which can donate funds to other eligible organizations or can provide support to individuals or families for sort of one-time short-term emergency support. They can also apply for funding to support their own programs. And in our guidelines in Chapter 2, there's a whole chapter dedicated to those types of groups. And as I mentioned earlier, we also provide funding to parent advisory committees. And that's at a rate of $20 per student based on last year's enrollment. And that's specifically for extracurricular activities, so not to do with supporting school time or classroom time. It's for all of those outside of school times. And we have our own guidelines for those, which we are currently working on and hope to have out in the next little while here. Okay, oops. All right, so now we're moving on to spending the grant. So an organization has got some grant funding and they want to know what they can do with it. So grant funds, as I had mentioned, are really meant to cover costs that are essential to the direct delivery of an approved program. So this can include things like wages of existing paid positions, and this year for also new positions. It can include rent, utilities, and insurance. It can include things like program supplies, office supplies, internet, phone costs, and program advertising directly related to the program. It can include rental or purchase of equipment that's needed for the direct delivery of the program. And it can also include some travel costs. So travel that would be essential to that direct delivery of the program within BC. There are some instances where out-of-province travel is permitted, but there's a separate request process for this, and you can find more information on that in our guidelines if you're interested. But of course, not many people are doing travel right now, but it is there. As I mentioned, our program is not meant for an organization's core operating costs. It's really meant for the program. But organizations can allocate a percentage of their core operating costs toward a program if those costs are directly related to the program delivery. So I've got an example here. So say an employee spends 40% of their time working on an eligible program, say it's a museum display, and 60% of their time working on non-eligible programs or other operational or administrative duties. So say there's a gift shop that they run, they do some grant writing, some board work, some other administration that's not related to the program. What you could do in this instance is that 40% of the employee's wage could be included as a program expense. So that's kind of what we mean by prorating. And another example here, if you had multiple programs. So an organization's director, for example, spends time on 4 programs in addition to organizational core duties. So 3 of these are approved programs, and the director spends an equal amount of time on all 5 activities. Therefore, 20% of the organization's wage could be included as an expense in each of the program budgets. And the same principle would apply to other core costs like rent, utilities, wages, supplies, insurance, and advertising, things like that. In addition to regular program funding, applicants can request funding for minor capital projects. So this would be capital projects with a total dollar value of under $20,000. Again, this would have to be essential for the delivery of an approved program. So some things that we've seen previously are small renovations or to do with accessibility, for example, like a wheelchair ramp. As well, we do fund small capital acquisitions. Again, they have to be required for the delivery of an approved program, and we do require quotes if the cost is over $5,000. So some things we've seen there to do with computers, other kinds of specialized equipment for the program, or vehicles. So one thing to note here is that organizations can't apply for minor capital projects or capital acquisitions only. It has to be part of a program. So basically, the request for a minor capital project or acquisition funding would be included as a part of the funding request for only one of the programs that an organization is applying for funding for. So for example, if you had two programs, but your acquisition benefits both programs, you would request funding only one time with just one of your programs in your application. So spending rules. Grant funds for every recipient are deposited into an organization's gaming account, and organizations must have this separate account for receiving, holding, and dispersing gaming funds. All of your expenses, so your eligible expenses, should be paid directly from the gaming account. Grant funds can be transferred either by check or electronically from the gaming account to your general account for the reimbursement of eligible program expenses. You can pay by check or board-approved electronic transfer, and all your invoices and receipts must be retained for 5 years. So how long do you have to spend your grant? So grants need to be spent within 12 months from when the funding was received. Funding can also be used for costs that were incurred in the same fiscal year that the grant was received. So for example, if your organization's fiscal year runs from January 1st to December 31st of 2021, and you received a grant on April 1st of 2021, you could either spend your grant forward until April 1st of 2022, or backwards to the beginning of your fiscal year, which started January 1st. So basically any costs that you incurred between January 1st and April 1st of that fiscal year could be essentially back paid. Okay, and all gaming grant spending has to be recorded in the gaming account summary report, otherwise known as the GASR. Organizations that receive gaming grant funding or have previously received a grant and still have money in their gaming account have to submit a GASR. This must be submitted to us within 90 days of the organization's fiscal year end, so after the fiscal year end is over. And the GASR details the gaming account balance at the beginning of the year, grants that were received in that year, any funding that was dispersed, and the balance at the end of the year. The GASR also requires a 300-word description on how the community benefited from the programs and services that were supported by the grant funding. So here's an example on the screen of what the gaming account summary report looks like. Organizations must submit all of their recent gaming account summary reports in order to receive another community gaming grant or a capital project grant. And all your grant spending must be detailed on this gaming account summary report. And this really just helps us to ensure that grant funding is only being used on eligible expenses. And just like our financial documentation on our website, you can find a blank gaming account summary report as well as an example gaming account summary report on our website. All right, so now we're going to talk a bit about the sort of nuts and bolts of applying for the grant. So these are our application intake periods for this year. So we are partway through February now, and right now the only open sector is arts and culture that opened on February 1st. On March 1st, sport is going to open up, followed by PACs and DPACs on April 1st, and then human and social services on June 1st, and the environment and public safety sectors both open on July 1st. We don't have dates yet for our capital project grant, but we're hoping to have those published sooner than later. So please check back on our website. But typically this grant stream is open during the summer, just as a heads up. So to apply, organizations would apply online through our website. We don't accept paper applications, and documents that are required as part of the application must be either attached to the application or emailed in to us. So again, they can't be mailed through the post. And before applying, as I mentioned at the outset, really helps to read the program guidelines and to check out the resources on our website. We've got lots of stuff there. There are things like pre-application checklists to just make sure everything's kind of all in order before you go to prepare your application. Now we've got those sample financial statements. We've got some frequently asked questions as well as tutorials. So in the event that an application is denied or an organization wants to request that the branch reconsiders their decision, there is a process to file a reconsideration request. The reconsideration request must be made within 30 days of the notification letter, and it must state the reasons why the decision should be varied or overturned in the opinion of the organization. We don't assess new information or documentation as part of this process. It's really just to make sure that the original assessment was fairly determined, and a final decision will be made within 90 days after we receive that request. So here's just some kind of good tips and advice for applying and preparing an application. As I mentioned, and I'll harp on it again, it really helps to read the most recent program guidelines. That kind of lays out everything you could possibly need to know. It helps to look at those pre-application checklists to just make sure you have all of those pieces in order. If you're able to have a professional review your financials, that is definitely helpful as well. If you have any questions, you can always phone a grant analyst. There's someone on the phones every single day. It helps to also have all of your required information and documents saved as a Word or a PDF for easy upload to your application. If there were notes in your previous notification letter, take a look at those and make sure that anything that's been pointed out has been addressed. And if relevant to that, it can help too to include a cover letter that addresses that previous notification letter and how you've rectified those items. Definitely make sure that your gaming account summary reports have been submitted. And last, just apply as early in the intake as possible because applications are processed in the order that they received, so you'll receive an answer earlier. All right, so we've made it through both of our grant programs. So now I'm just gonna go over some resources just to leave you all with. So if you need to get in touch with us, you can do that with any follow-up questions at any time. So I mentioned our website several times. You don't need to note down the email address. You can just Google community gaming grants and we should come up. But there's a ton of resources on there, including our guidelines. As I mentioned, we have an email and phone that anyone can contact us on, and there's somebody who monitors the email account and someone who's dedicated to the phone every day, as well as my email that I monitor, as well as we have a policy analyst who also monitors the email, and that's the community outreach inbox. And then we have the BCACG, otherwise known as the British Columbia Association of Charitable Gaming, of which Kalina is representing today. And so the BCACG, for those who might not know, they're a provincial not-for-profit organization that helps to sort of liaise between community groups and the community gaming grants branch as well. and they receive some community gaming grant funding to provide support services to charities and not-for-profits for the purpose of applying for community gaming grants. So they're an awesome resource. They put on webinars all the time if you ever want to tune into one again. But I would definitely encourage anyone to reach out to them if they want some kind of hands-on assistance with their application or have questions. As well, the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres also receives community gaming grant funding, and they have a similar mandate to the BCACG, but they're more focused on providing support to Indigenous not-for-profit organizations. And finally, there are community gaming grant associations, which are regionally based not-for-profit organizations that support their local charities and community grants with their applications to community gaming grants. And there's several around the province. So that is that.
Thank you for watching. For more information on the BC Community Gaming Grant and upcoming live webinars, you can contact the Gaming Branch or BCACG at gamingquestions@bcacg.com. Thank you.